Hi, I'm John Maxwell. When the top companies in the world are looking for trainers, speakers, and coaches, there's one name that stands above the rest, and that's Maxwell Leadership. Our certified team members have gotten proven results for companies all over the globe, and our reputation, I'm proud to say, is second to none. Some of our members have risen to the top of their profession, including the one you're going to meet today. I proudly introduce you to my friend Bob Fabian Zinka.
Welcome to the Leadership and Success Podcast with your host, Coach BZ, where we help you lead with purpose and succeed with impact. If you're ready to grow into the kind of leader others want to follow, this podcast is for you. If you're determined to elevate your success and leave a lasting legacy, this podcast is for you. As my mentor, Dr. John C. Maxwell reminds us, everything rises and falls on leadership. Our goal is simple: to inspire you, challenge you, and equip you with insights that can transform the trajectory of your leadership journey. Welcome aboard to another episode of the Leadership and Success Podcast with Coach BZ.
Hey everyone, welcome to this special edition of the Leadership and Success Podcast. So this is season 250, not our regular season 5. That's because this is about America 250, Black History Year. We're going to try almost every day to have a podcast and an article about Black history. Today's topic for Black history is extremely personal to me. I'm reminded to first do our moment of gratitude, which is our custom here. We like to spend just a moment every single time that we meet just to be grateful. Because it's impossible to be suicidal and be grateful at the very same time. So if you would maybe close your eyes, put yourself in your happy place and think about one thing you are grateful for right in this very moment. Today, I think I'm really grateful for faith, hope, and love. When I think about Black history, what people of African descent have had to go through, not just in this country, not just in the US, but really all around the world, even in their own continent in Africa, all of the challenges they've had to face. I think it really takes faith, it takes hope, and it takes love to get through all of it. And I am really, really grateful for that. And us always trying to really get better, not bitter. Because in many ways, descendant of African could really say, okay, now we need our revenge. We're going to do to you what you guys did to us. But no, we never do that. We always think about, okay, let's build a more perfect union. Let's make it better, not just for us, but for everyone. Let's not exclude anyone. Like when this country was initially set up, they excluded even white women, not included. Poor white men, not included. Black people, definitely not included. We always try to include every single one, and I think that is just beautiful, and that is a legacy we can definitely stand on. So I am grateful today for hope, for faith, and for love. So let me know in the comment where you are watching us from, what city, what state, and if outside of the US, which country. Like I say, it's not just a African American thing, and this Black history is really global. It's the Pan-Africanism, whether you are in the US, in the island, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in South America, in Europe, if you are a African, English or French, or even in Africa itself, our continent of origin, it is really global. So where are you watching us from? And also what you are grateful for today. And when you listen to the podcast, let us know 3 to 5 ideas takeaway from today's podcast, if you would type it in the comment. I want to say hello to Daniel Young from Maitland, Florida. So glad to see you, Daniel. So today's podcast is going to be a little bit personal. It took me a while to write. I was so emotional because we're going to be talking about the leadership lesson from America's very first documented family of African descent, a journey to my kin, Anthony, Isabella, and William Tucker. This is quite amazing. It was, I think, a week and a half ago, I found out the name of the very first African American born in the United States, in the American colonies in Virginia. So most people may know, right? 1619 is when the very first African slave came into the U.S. Port Comfort. What an irony! The name of the port in Virginia, and Captain William Tucker was in charge, and Captain William Tucker actually became the enslaver of this first couple. We don't know what their African name were. I know for sure they had African name from the Ndolo kingdom, the Kingdom, which today's would encompass Angola, the Republic of the Congo, Zaire, or Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's where my direct ancestors came from. So these are my kin ancestors. And here is a picture of what they may have looked like: Anthony, Isabella, and William. And Anthony and Isabella, initially in that part of the kingdom, the Portuguese were the one who did the trafficking originally. So they had Portuguese name Antonio and Isabel. And then when they came to the US, their name were anglicized. It became Anthony and Isabel. But their firstborn child, William, we believe was born probably around December the 20th, 1623. That's an estimate. That's because he was baptized, we know for sure, on January 3rd, 1624, the Anglican Church, right? The Church of England. And that was recorded. And by canon and law, people got baptized about 2 weeks after they were born. So that's why we estimate he was born around December 20th, 1623. But the thing is, they actually existed. There is the census in Virginia from 1624, 1625 that lists Anthony Nigo, Isabel Nigo, meaning that they were black, and then their son William, baby William. And out of that, there is actually, again, I didn't know, it took a family cemetery in Hampton, Virginia, William Tucker 1624 Society. And these are the direct descendant of William Tucker. So I am actually related to all of them, and I can't wait to go out there and really be reconnected with my kins. And again, the kingdom we come from, the Doro Kingdom, the Congo Kingdom in Central Africa, Angola, the Republic of the Congo, where I was born, Zaire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which ended up being colonized by Portuguese for Angola, France, the Congo where I was born, and then Belgium, the Congo that became Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But anyway, it's really an amazing story how they came from Africa, the very first slaves in America, 1619 on August 20th. And then they landed Port Comfort, Jamestown, Virginia, American colony. It is just so amazing. Me as an immigrant coming to the US January 1996 and kind of being reconnected with my kin, ancestor, my history that was lost, which is another thing. Right now, there is a lot of push into erasing Black history, but you really cannot do that, right? It is written. It is in medical records, census, military record, Navy record, like the Virginia census. The history is there. There is absolutely no way you can erase it. It's just impossible to erase. We cannot be erased from history. So I am so grateful for that, because you can remove an exhibit, you can shut down a museum, you can ban a book, but no, the history will never be erased. Can you imagine 400 years after my kin ancestor was born, baby William Tucker, me one of his kin descendant, 400 years later, moving from Africa, where the Congo Vendolo Kingdom used to be, coming to America and being reconnected to that history. Like I know many people, they kind of like to brag, oh, my ancestor came on the Mayflower. Well, guess what? The African slave came here before that. They came here in August 1619. I think the Mayflower was like in November. So this American history even preceded the people from the Mayflower. Isn't that amazing? How much our history is tied together. African history, Black history, African American history is part of American history. It cannot be erased. So anyway, I am going to play the podcast. Is about 30 minutes long or so. So as you are listening, take notes and also write down 3 to 5 takeaway from today's podcast. So I will be back right after that.
So, picture this. It is 1624. You have two parents living in the early Virginia colony, and they're standing in a parish church naming their newborn son.
Right.
And they name him William Tucker, which, you know, on the surface, it sounds like a perfectly ordinary, perfectly fine colonial name.
Totally normal for the time.
Right. Until you realize exactly who these parents were, because the colonial ledgers only record them as an African man and woman named Anthony and Isabella.
Yeah.
And the man who actively enslaved them, the man who claimed them as property, his name was Captain William Tucker.
That is just, I mean, it's a staggering detail to uncover.
It really is. And for a long time, if you just looked at that historical record on its face, it seemed like, I guess, an absolute surrender, like a complete capitulation to this inherently brutal colonial system.
Right, because why else would you name your child after your captor?
Exactly. But historians are now looking much more closely at the specific context of 17th century Virginia, and they're realizing this was likely the exact opposite of a surrender. It was actually this masterful, just desperate strategy of survival.
It really forces you to completely rethink the entire narrative of early America, honestly. Because, well, when you look at this 1624 and 1625 Virginia muster, which is essentially this massive, incredibly detailed census that the British Crown ordered.
Right, it's mostly just a giant inventory list.
Exactly. It is entirely clinical. You read through page after fragile page of just sheer bureaucratic bookkeeping. They're counting, barrels of corn, pounds of salted fish, matchlock muskets, armor, livestock.
Just totally dehumanizing administrative data.
Yeah. But then, on one of those pages, you hit this single isolated line. It literally just reads, quote, Anthony Negro, Isabel Negro, and William their child baptized.
Wow.
And that one line, that tiny fragment, it documents what many scholars consider to be the earliest recorded family of African descent living together in English North America.
And that one line is the anchor for our entire deep dive today, because we are exploring the origins of American identity, and we're doing it through this extensively researched, really powerful article by U.S. Navy Information Warfare Commander Bob Fabian Zinga.
Who goes by BZ.
Right, BZ. He wrote this piece looking ahead to America's 250th birthday, and he uses Anthony, Isabella, and baby William as the central focal point. But he doesn't just stick to the Virginia muster.
No, he goes way beyond that.
Yeah, he pulls in 3 major historical works to reconstruct the entire world this family actually navigated. And what struck me immediately about his approach is the methodology he establishes right up front.
It's so crucial for anyone looking into history.
It really is. He insists that if we are going to dive into this, we have to separate documented historical fact from reasonable historical inference, and then we have to separate both of those from, like, family tradition or mythology.
Which is really the only way to read history without projecting all of our own modern biases right onto it. I mean, Virginia muster gives us the documented fact, right?
Yeah.
These 3 specific individuals existed. They were physically in Captain Tucker's household in Elizabeth City, and the child was in fact baptized. But the ledger does not give us their internal lives.
No, it tells us absolutely nothing about what they were feeling or thinking.
Exactly. It doesn't tell us why they made their choices. So to understand the actual mechanisms of their survival, we have to rely on historical inference.
Meaning we have to look at the surrounding laws, the local economy, the geopolitical landscape they were violently taken from.
Precisely. Because the gaps in the archive are just massive. But by using that rigorous context, we can actually map the negative space of their lives.
Which means, to truly understand them, we can't start this story in Jamestown.
No, absolutely not.
Because if you begin the story of Anthony and Isabella on the shores of Virginia, you are starting their narrative right in the middle of a kidnapping.
Yeah, you're missing the entire foundation of who they were.
You completely strip them of the world that actually formed their minds and their strategies. And Commander Zinga points this out by drawing really heavily on historian Linda M. Haywood's biography. It's called Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen.
That book is incredible.
It's so good. Haywood uses Portuguese, Dutch, and Vatican archives to reconstruct the Kingdom of Ndongo, which covered parts of modern-day Angola and the Congos. And the society she describes in the late 16th and early 17th centuries completely dismantles those old, simplistic narratives about pre-colonial Africa.
Oh, completely. We are talking about a highly centralized, incredibly complex political and military state. Ndongo wasn't just some loose collection of isolated villages.
Right, which is the stereotype a lot of people were taught.
Exactly. It had a rigid political hierarchy, this highly advanced diplomatic corps, and a formidable military infrastructure. They were actively engaged in global geopolitics.
Because the Portuguese had established a colony at Luanda right next door, right?
Right, and they were aggressively trying to expand their slave trade and their territorial control inland. But Ndongo wasn't just rolling over. They were fiercely resisting this encroachment, not just through warfare, but through highly calculated diplomacy.
And the absolute master of that calculated diplomacy was Queen Njinga Mbande. She lived from roughly 1583 to 1663. And when you read Haywood's account of how she operated, I mean, she is playing three-dimensional geopolitical chess.
She really was a visionary leader.
Yeah. Like at one point, to counter the Portuguese military advantage, she actively forged alliances with the Dutch. She recognized the European rivalries and just exploited them.
She pitted the Dutch right against the Portuguese to secure her own kingdom's borders.
It's wild. She even strategically converted to Catholicism, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa. And it wasn't necessarily out of some sudden religious awakening. It was this brilliant diplomatic mechanism to open direct lines of communication with the Vatican.
Which allowed her to completely bypass the local Portuguese governors who were trying to control her.
Exactly. The mechanism of her leadership was just this uncanny ability to adapt instantly to whatever leverage was available in the room. And there is this deeply illustrative moment that Haywood details, happening in 1622.
Oh, the peace treaty negotiation. That is such a powerful story.
It really is. So Njinga, this is before she was officially queen, she's sent by her brother, the current king, to negotiate a peace treaty with the Portuguese governor down in Luanda. And the governor decides to employ this very specific, really petty tactic of physical intimidation.
Right, it's a classic power play.
Yeah. So when Njinga enters the negotiation room, the governor is seated in this large, elevated chair. But he has deliberately provided no chair for her at all. He just laid out a floor mat.
And in 17th century diplomatic protocol, whether you're in Europe or Africa, seating arrangements are not about comfort.
No, not at all.
They are entirely about geopolitical hierarchy. If she sits on that floor mat, she is physically looking up at him. She would be legally conceding that Ndongo is a subordinate vassal state to Portugal.
She'd be negotiating from a position of acknowledged weakness before a single word is even spoken.
Exactly. The governor is actively trying to use the physical environment to dictate the political reality of the treaty.
But Njinga recognizes the trap instantly. And she doesn't argue about the lack of a chair. She doesn't storm out. She simply gives this glance to one of her attendants. The attendant drops to their hands and knees, and Njinga calmly sits upon her attendant's back.
It gives me chills every time I hear it.
It's so brilliant. She elevates herself so that she is looking the Portuguese governor directly in the eye, perfectly level. Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's like walking into a high-stakes, incredibly hostile corporate merger where the other side deliberately removes your chair to establish dominance, and you instantly just create your own throne to level the playing field without even blinking.
That is a perfect analogy. The governor attempted to force this rigid, degrading protocol on her, and she bypassed it entirely. She neutralized his leverage without ever breaking the outward decorum of the meeting.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is why beginning with Ndongo is so vital for understanding Anthony and Isabella.
Absolutely, because Anthony and Isabella were born into this specific civilization. They were shaped by a culture that deeply understood the nuances of power, a culture that produced these displays of unyielding dignity in the face of colonial aggression.
They weren't blank slates.
Not at all. They possessed the cultural DNA of a society that knew exactly how to negotiate with European powers, how to read a room, and how to assert agency when the odds were completely stacked against them.
That was the intellectual and political toolkit they possessed before they were captured, before they were forced onto the Portuguese slave ship São João Bautista, and subjected to the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage.
And their actual arrival in Virginia in 1619, that was its own chaotic geopolitical accident, honestly.
Right, because they weren't even supposed to end up in Virginia.
No. The São João Bautista was originally headed for Veracruz, Mexico. But it was intercepted in the Gulf of Mexico by two English privateer ships, the White Lion and the Treasure.
Basically English pirates.
Pretty much, yeah.
Huh.
These privateers essentially robbed the Portuguese ship of its cargo, which unfortunately included Anthony and Isabella, and they brought them to Point Comfort in Virginia just to trade them for food and supplies.
So they are suddenly thrown into this struggling, frankly miserable English colony, completely severed from their extended family networks and their homeland.
And immediately upon arrival, they are systematically stripped of their most fundamental marker of identity, their names.
Yeah.
Commander Zinga focuses heavily on this administrative erasure. Because the colonial ledgers, they only record them as Anthony and Isabella.
Which were probably anglicized approximations or just entirely new labels assigned by whoever bought them.
Exactly. And to understand the gravity of what that means, you have to look at the linguistic and cultural mechanisms of naming in West Central African societies.
Right, because it's not just a social tag like it is for a lot of people today.
Far from it. In many of those traditions, naming is an ontological act. A name literally confers existence. It confers purpose and ancestral connection. It dictates a person's responsibilities to their entire community.
So when the colonial system erases a person's true name and just slaps an inventory label on them, it is engaging in deliberate psychological warfare.
Yes, it is a direct attempt to sever the individual from their history, because a population with no memory of its past is vastly easier to subjugate and control.
And Commander Zinga brings us into such a sharp personal focus in his article because, he wasn't just researching this in some abstract, dry academic sense. He was actually born in the Republic of the Congo.
Right, he has a direct tie to this geography.
Yeah. His father was a tribal prince whose lineage connects directly to the historical kingdom of Nongo. The family name Zinga, or Nzinga, carries that exact royal heritage we were just talking about with the queen.
That's amazing.
It is. And even though the title today obviously doesn't wield the political authority it once did back in the 1600s, it functions as this unbroken chain to the past. He knows exactly who his ancestors were.
And he powerfully contrasts his own lived experience with his wife's experience.
Yeah.
His wife, Demetria, descends directly from enslaved African Americans.
Right.
She, like millions of Black Americans today, confronts this painful reality that the archival record just abruptly goes dark. The ledgers hold only the names assigned by enslavers, leaving this permanent, unbridgeable silence where the ancestral names, the names spoken in love in Ndongo or wherever they came from, should be.
Zinga actually talks about his own African name, which was given to him by his mother. His name is Minu, which translates to faith and hope. And he writes about how when he faces impossible challenges in his life, just the simple act of remembering what his mother named him gives him a mechanism for resilience.
He literally draws strength from his identity.
Exactly. And Anthony and Isabella had that exact source of strength violently stolen from them. We will never know what they called each other in private, but we do know what they called their son. Which brings us right back to the mystery of William Tucker.
Yes. And this is exactly where we have to transition from the documented fact of the 1624 ledger into reasonable historical inference. Because we have to ask, why on earth would Anthony and Isabella name their child William Tucker?
Right. Was it just forced compliance, or is there something deeper happening?
Well, the historical record is silent on their internal motivation. But when we apply the context of early Virginia, a couple of theories emerge. The most common assumption, if you just glance casually at the record, is coercion.
Right, that Captain Tucker simply pointed at the child and dictated the name.
Or that standard English baptismal practices of the time just defaulted to the enslaver's name.
Mm-hmm.
But when you factor in the intense political acumen and the deep cultural significance of naming that Anthony and Isabella brought with them from the Dongo, you really have to look at a second theory.
A theory that views this not as a surrender, but as a highly calculated maneuver.
Exactly.
Huh.
If you look at the mechanics of survival in a 17th century English parish, social capital was literally everything. Virginia in the 1620s was an incredibly lethal place. The mortality rates from disease, starvation, and conflict were staggering.
People were dying left and right.
Constantly.
Yeah.
So if Anthony and Isabella understood the environment they were operating in, they would have recognized that a child with a traditional African name would immediately be marked as other.
Right. That child would be placed completely outside the protective, albeit meager, bounds of English common law and social custom.
So by naming him William Tucker, they are actively cloaking him. They are giving him the linguistic armor of the local power structure.
Wow.
In a small colonial settlement, bearing the exact name of a powerful, wealthy captain might actually make a local magistrate hesitate before treating the boy harshly. It might secure him a slightly better ration of food when supplies got low.
It's an agonizing compromise to make as a parent. They are actively choosing to sever their son's linguistic tie to their African heritage in order to physically anchor him to the brutal realities of English colonial survival.
It is the ultimate exercise of parental leadership under extreme duress. It acknowledges the horrific reality of their environment, and it attempts to hack the system from the bottom up.
But to truly understand why this kind of extreme survival strategy was necessary, you have to look at the kind of society he was trying to survive. We have to examine the specific machinery of the colony that was being built around them, because the Virginia of 1624 was not a fully formed slave society yet.
No, not at all. It was something far more volatile.
Yeah.
And this is where Commander Zinga introduces the historian Edmund S. Morgan and his landmark 1975 study, American Slavery, American Freedom.
And Morgan's work is essential here because it completely dismantles the idea that American racial slavery arrived fully formed in 1619.
Right. When we picture colonial Virginia today, we often picture these massive plantations heavily reliant on enslaved African labor. But if you look at the actual labor demographics of early 17th century Virginia, the workforce was overwhelmingly composed of poor, white, English indentured servants.
Because the entire mechanism driving the colony was the cultivation of tobacco. Tobacco was the only thing keeping Virginia financially viable for the Virginia Company and the British Crown.
But growing it is back-breaking, grueling, labor-intensive work. So to get workers, the colonial elites utilized the headright system and indentured servitude.
Right. They would pay the transatlantic passage for poor Europeans, and in return, those Europeans signed contracts to work the tobacco fields for a set term, usually like 4 to 7 years.
And the promise was always that if you survived your contract, you would receive freedom dues, which often included a piece of land to start your own farm, some tools, some seed.
But the grim reality for the first few decades was that the elites didn't really have to worry about paying those freedom dues, did they?
No, because the mortality rate was just astronomical. These indentured servants were dying of dysentery, malaria, and starvation long before their contracts ever expired. It was basically a death sentence.
Right. However, as the decades passed, as we moved toward the mid to late 1600s, the environment actually stabilized a little bit. People started developing immunities. Servants started outliving their contracts.
And that created an unprecedented socioeconomic crisis for the ruling class. Because suddenly you have this rapidly growing population of newly freed, landless, armed, and deeply frustrated young white men roaming around.
They've done their time and they want their land.
Exactly. But they are being pushed out to the western frontiers of the colony to find available land, which puts them in direct, violent conflict with indigenous tribes. Meanwhile, the elites in the Tidewater region are hoarding all the best, safest land and heavily taxing these newly freed men.
All while offering them literally no political representation in the House of Burgesses. It's a total powder keg.
A massive powder keg. And in 1676, that powder keg detonates in what we know today as Bacon's Rebellion. Yeah. Nathaniel Bacon, who was this charismatic and honestly somewhat rogue member of the gentry himself, he taps right into this massive reservoir of lower-class anger.
But the most terrifying aspect of Bacon's rebellion for the colonial elite wasn't just that poor white farmers were angry and burning things. It was who they allied with.
Exactly. When Nathaniel Bacon marched on Jamestown and literally burned the colonial capital to the ground, his ranks were a multiracial coalition.
Wow.
He had united poor, disgruntled white indentured servants with poor, exploited black laborers and enslaved Africans. They stood and fought side by side.
So for the wealthy planters who are standing there watching their capital burn, the sight of an armed, multiracial underclass acting in total unison was their absolute worst nightmare realized.
They realized in that moment that if the working class figured out their shared economic plight outweighed their racial or cultural differences, the elite oligarchy would be overthrown permanently.
It's as if the leaders of the colony were on a sinking ship, taking on water from these class rebellions. And to plug the hole, they decided to build a permanent, inescapable lower deck based entirely on race, sealing it shut with colonial law.
That's exactly what happened.
Huh?
They had to engineer a solution. They couldn't stop growing tobacco, so they still desperately needed massive amounts of cheap labor. But they could no longer risk relying on European indentured servants who would eventually demand land, guns, and voting rights.
Right. So the solution they engineer is to systematically, legally sever that alliance between poor whites and poor blacks. And they don't do it with a single overnight decree. They do it through a highly calculated series of legislative mechanisms over several decades.
This is where we see the conscious, deliberate construction of race in American law. You can trace the exact statutes. One of the most pivotal mechanisms was passed in 1662, prior to the rebellion, but accelerating that shift. It was the doctrine of partus sequitur eventum.
Right. And under traditional English common law, a child's legal status always followed the father, correct?
Yes. If the father was free, the child was free. But the Virginia Assembly flipped this entirely for Africans. They ruled that the legal status of a child born in the colony would follow the condition of the mother.
The economic implications of that one law are staggering. It guaranteed that the children born to enslaved African women would automatically become the permanent property of the enslaver, effectively creating a self-replicating hereditary labor force.
Yes, and it also provided this horrific legal shield for white male enslavers to sexually assault enslaved women, knowing the resulting children would only increase their own wealth, rather than create any legal or financial liabilities for them.
It was basically an economic hack encoded straight into the law. And following Bacon's rebellion, that legislative wedge was driven even deeper, culminating in the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705.
Right, which explicitly established that all Africans brought into the colony who were not Christians in their native land were to be considered real estate.
Real estate, not people.
Exactly. But crucially, the laws also offered these distinct, albeit minor psychological and legal privileges to poor white colonists. Poor whites were legally permitted to physically discipline enslaved individuals. They were required to serve in slave patrols.
It's like rewriting the zoning laws of society. If the elite were terrified of the lower class uniting to burn down the city, they decided to completely redesign the architecture. They built a permanent subterranean floor for Africans, locked the doors with the 1705 slave codes, and literally gave the keys to the poor white laborers.
Right.
They told the poor white laborers, you may not own the mansion, you may be starving in the fields alongside them, but at least you are not on the bottom floor. And it worked. It completely dismantled the class solidarity we saw in Bacon's rebellion.
And this raises an incredibly important question about the nature of American democracy, which is exactly what Edmund Morgan defines as the American paradox. The paradox is that the rise of liberty, democratic representation, and economic mobility for white Americans was inextricably linked to the systematic degradation and enslavement of Black Americans.
Wow.
By creating a permanent racial underclass, the Virginian elite completely removed the threat of a massive rebellious white underclass. The freedom and equality espoused by the Founding Fathers were practically subsidized by the fact that they had solved their laboring class conflict problems through hereditary racial slavery.
Which means race, as a system of social hierarchy, wasn't some natural biological reality that the colonists simply observed. It was a tool they actively invented. They engineered racism to solve a specific economic and political crisis in the 17th century.
Yes.
And the tragedy is that once you encode that kind of algorithm into the foundation of a society, it just runs automatically for centuries. You can't build your primary economic engine on a profound moral failing and expect the social fabric to remain untorn. Prosperity without justice carries a massive hidden cost.
And that realization that the legal and economic architecture constructed in colonial Virginia formed the very bedrock of the United States brings us directly to the modern debates over how this history should be taught and internalized today.
Right. Which Commander Zinga addresses head-on by engaging with the 1619 Project, a new origin story edited by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And I want to get into this because the 1619 Project posits a very specific, very ambitious premise.
It does.
It argues that we should reframe our understanding of American history by placing the year 1619, the arrival of the first captive Africans in Virginia, at the very center of our national narrative. The contributors to the project argue that the mechanisms of slavery didn't just affect the South. They shaped the development of American capitalism, the disparities in our modern healthcare system, the structures of our justice system, and the evolution of American music and culture.
But the most central theme of the 1619 Project, and the one that connects most deeply with the story of Anthony, Isabella, and Queen Njinga that we've been talking about, is the concept of Black agency.
Yes, that is so key.
The project forcefully argues against the traditional textbook narrative that so often portrays Black Americans primarily as passive victims just waiting around for emancipation. Instead, it frames them as the truest builders of American democracy.
The thesis being that through centuries of resistance, legal challenges, and civil rights struggles, Black Americans consistently forced the United States to actually live up to the magnificent, egalitarian ideals drafted in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
They were the ones constantly holding the founding documents up to the light and demanding that the words apply to everyone.
But I want to pause here for a second because we know the 1619 Project has faced vigorous, intense debate from prominent historians about its chronology and some of its claims. And if you are listening to this right now and you see Pulitzer Prize-winning authors and esteemed university professors clashing over these historical interpretations, what are you supposed to do with it?
It's confusing for a lot of people.
It is. The instinct for many people is to view it as a political proxy war, pick whichever side aligns with their current worldview, and completely ignore the other.
Right, and that is exactly what Commander Zinga advises against doing. He uses this public pushback to advocate for true intellectual curiosity. His argument is that when historical experts disagree, your responsibility as an informed citizen isn't to just retreat into an ideological echo chamber.
No.
Your responsibility is to read the arguments themselves. He explicitly advocates reading the 1619 Project alongside the primary sources, like the Virginia Muster, and works by historians who critique it or offer different lenses. Read Edmund Morgan, read Annette Gordon Reed, read John Hope Franklin.
Because engaging with contested history isn't about picking a team. It's about recognizing that patriotism and historical honesty can actually coexist.
Exactly. A great nation grows stronger through rigorous, honest self-examination. And Commander Zinga doesn't just leave this as some abstract academic exercise. He takes all of these massive historical threads, the diplomacy of Ndongo, the ledger entries of Jamestown, the legal codes of Virginia, the modern debates over 1619, and he distills them into 5 highly practical leadership lessons.
Which I love because it takes all this heavy history and gives you a way to apply it. Let's walk through those mechanisms because they are incredibly grounding. The first lesson he extracts is that leadership begins with family. Before nations are built, individual lives are shaped.
Right. We are conditioned to think of leadership as generals commanding armies or politicians drafting legislation. But Anthony and Isabella had zero political power. They were legally classified as property. Yet, by successfully holding their family unit together and securing the baptism of their son in an environment actively designed to commodify and destroy them, they exercised the most foundational form of leadership. They preserved the fundamental unit of human society.
The second lesson is an extension of that exact survival. Identity can be suppressed, but not destroyed.
Yes.
The colonial bureaucracy used the Virginia Muster and subsequent ledgers to strip away African names, attempting to just overwrite their humanity with administrative data. But those ledgers could not erase their inherent dignity. The bureaucratic suppression of identity is powerful, but human resilience consistently outlasts the colonial paperwork.
And that leads right into the third lesson, which I think is perhaps the most profound of them all. Hope is an act of leadership.
That's a powerful phrase.
It really is. It is very easy to equate hope with naive optimism. But for Anthony and Isabella, hope was a tactical decision. Every agonizing compromise they made, including strategically naming their son after their enslaver, was an investment in a future they knew they would likely never experience themselves. True leadership is planting a tree knowing you will never live to sit in its shade. They were planting seeds of survival for a generation they couldn't even see.
Wow. The fourth lesson pivots back to how we actually handle the archives. History requires humility. When we study the past, we are always working with fragmented data. We have to respect the truth by maintaining that strict boundary between documented fact, reasonable inference, and tradition.
Right, because if we arrogantly mold historical fragments to fit a modern agenda, we do a terrible disservice to the people who actually lived it. We must have the humility to let the archives speak, even when their silence is deeply frustrating.
And the fifth lesson synthesizes everything together. America's story is a shared story. Black history is not a supplementary chapter or a footnote. It is not an elective. The story of Anthony, Isabella, and William Tucker is woven into the very first threads of the colonial fabric, decades before the United States even existed.
You cannot understand the architecture of the house without looking at how the foundation was poured. And that shared story comes full circle in a deeply physical way in Commander Zinga's own life.
Right, his arrival story.
Yeah. He writes about his arrival in the United States on January 6, 1996. He was a young immigrant stepping off a plane, believing he was initiating a completely new, isolated chapter in his family's history. But as he began this historical research, he realized he wasn't just arriving in a new land. He was retracing a path forged centuries earlier by people from his exact region, perhaps even his extended kin network.
But whereas they arrived in the suffocating hold of the San Juan Bautista in bondage, he arrived in the sky in freedom. He came to America and found the ghosts of his ancestors already here, documented in the very foundation of the country.
It fundamentally changes how you view your place in the world. And that connection to the past isn't just an abstract feeling. It is anchored in a physical location that you can go and stand in today. The Tucker Family Cemetery in Hampton, Virginia.
Right. It is one of the oldest African-American burial grounds in the area. It serves as the final resting place for generations of the Tucker family and others of African descent. And in 2018, the Commonwealth of Virginia formally dedicated it as perpetual open space land.
The preservation of that cemetery is the ultimate counter-argument to the Virginia muster. The historical ledgers, the economic systems, and the colonial laws all operated as mechanisms of erasure. They attempted to reduce human beings to property in numbers.
But the Tucker Family Cemetery stands as a physical, undeniable testament to the fact that while the system tried to erase them, love preserved them. And centuries later, historical memory has restored them to their rightful place in the narrative.
So as the United States approaches its 250th birthday, we really have to ask what the purpose of examining this painful history actually is. Commander Zinga is very intentional about this. The goal is not to assign inherited, paralyzing guilt to people living today who obviously had nothing to do with 17th century laws.
Right, the goal is clarity. It is about understanding the systemic mechanisms that build our modern reality so we can make informed choices today.
Because without truth, there is no foundation for trust. A society that relies on historical amnesia or comfortable mythology will eventually fracture along the fault lines of its own unacknowledged paradoxes. Truth builds trust, trust produces the capacity for reconciliation, and reconciliation is the prerequisite for continuing the work that Abraham Lincoln described at Gettysburg.
Building a more perfect union requires acknowledging everyone who actually built it. It has been a massive journey today. We started in the royal courts of Ndongo, looking at the absolute diplomatic brilliance of Queen Nzinga, bypassing the Portuguese governor's trap. We examined the agonizing tactical compromises Anthony and Isabella made in Jamestown to cloak their son in the linguistic armor of their enslaver.
We looked at the mechanisms of Bacon's rebellion and how colonial elites literally engineered racism into the legal code to solve a labor crisis.
And we saw how a modern Navy commander used all of this to find his own ancestral footprint. For you listening, this deep dive is ultimately a challenge. Look at the systems, the teams, and the communities you operate in today. Are the mechanisms you rely on planting seeds of hope, like Anthony and Isabella did? Or are you, perhaps unknowingly, operating on old cultural algorithms that perpetuate old paradoxes and sacrifice the dignity of some for the comfort of others?
And as we close, I'm going to leave you with one final haunting reality to ponder regarding the archives. We have spent an hour discussing the power of historical inference, trying to map the negative space where the facts end. We know from the documented fact of the ledger that baby William Tucker was baptized in 1624.
Right.
Because of that ink on a page, we look back at him today as an incredibly powerful symbol of endurance and hope. But the historical record falls entirely silent on what actually happened to him as he grew into adulthood.
He just vanishes from the paperwork.
Entirely. We do not know if he survived childhood. We do not know who he loved, what he built, or how he died. What does it mean for us today that the very first documented black child in English America exists in our collective memory almost exclusively as a symbol of hope, while his actual lived experience growing up day by day in a Virginia that was actively drafting the inescapable permanent machinery of racial slavery all around him is utterly lost to the silence of history?
All right, that's the podcast for today. Thank you so much for watching. And last thing I'm going to say is usually I only write one article, right? But in this case, I had to write a second article to focus more on the leadership portion of this. To me, it's a life-changing discovery, knowing exactly who the very first African-American family was in the U.S. back in 1623. And so you will see links to two separate articles. One is be HY, Black History Year, which is the one the podcast will be based on, but I have a separate article with the same title, but it's a lead article for leadership, excellence, accountability, and devotion. That's the LinkedIn article I use to just expand on the leadership development. And I also add a biblical lens on those leadership principles, because leadership isn't anything new. It's as old as Earth, right? And a lot of the leadership principles that we apply, that we learn today, have been around for as long as the Earth has been around. And you can find them in ancient scriptures like the Bible. So I have that lens. And then I also have one additional bonus leadership lesson, which was not included in the original Black History Year article. So check it out and find out what that lesson is. Or I can give you an hint. The bonus lesson really has to do with resilience, right? Because I think that's really what, to me, define the descendant of African. We are extremely, extremely resilient. We go through the impossible, right? Takes a licking, but keeps on ticking. It is really, really powerful. So check it out. So this is it for now. I don't see any question in the comments. So I'm going to end the show like we've been ending it since Juneteenth, right? Really celebrating freedom, because I was born to be free. So powerful. And everyone in this country should enjoy that freedom. All men created equal, right? Given inalienable rights by the Creator, which I believe is God, for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are our foundational core value: equality among all people. That includes women, that includes the gay, that includes the black, that includes everybody. Equal. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Freedom, freedom, freedom. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. And before I be a slave,
Thank you for tuning in to the Leadership and Success Podcast with your host, Coach BZ. If today's episode added value to your leadership journey, be sure to subscribe, share, and join us again for more wisdom nuggets on how to lead better and achieve greater success. Remember, leadership is the most critical skill of our time. The world will always need leaders to inspire others, drive innovation, and execute meaningful strategy. So why not count yourself among the bold leaders shaping the 21st century? Until next time, stay inspired, stay committed, and keep leading with excellence.